Hi there, I'm here to tell you about fantasy football and why I love to play fantasy football. Fantasy football, you get to take on the role of a general manager for a NFL team, and you get to remix all the rosters of the teams that are in the NFL, and you get to choose players based on their skill level and how they fit on the team that you're trying to build. So you take these players, you remix them, you put them on new teams, on new fantasy teams, and then the owners of those teams then will be able to take those statistics that players earn in a game, either yards running or receiving, multiply those by a coefficient, and then turn those statistics into points. And then as fantasy teams play against each other, they compare those points, and who scored the most can win in a week. You win them enough times over a season, then you can become the champion. And so it's good competition. It takes skills to evaluate the players, but then also you need to make predictions going forward on how are game conditions, how are the opponents going to affect the skills of those players, and you can make choices on who to play each week. So it's a challenging game. It takes a lot of strategy. There's also a lot of luck involved, and so I have my lucky jersey on today for good luck when I'm drafting in my fantasy, and I'm wearing it for good luck today for the my presentation.
And so it's so important in fantasy football to have good support. And one of the websites I've always used for that support, that expert support, is FFToday or Fantasy Football Today. So when I needed to join an affinity space, which is basically an online community, I looked first at the FF Today website with their fantasy football community. And so Fantasy Football Today is a community of experts. They write articles and they do rankings and projections for players. And this is really the novice level of community members. They would read the articles about players, look at rankings for different positions or projections, maybe get some overall NFL news. And then as players become more seasoned within the community, they might start using tools that you need to sign in for, or the My Fantasy Today, which is the sign in piece where you can customize different stat or scorings based on your leagues and players. Right now, this seems to be down, so I can't go into the My FF Today features. But the highest level or the most deeply committed members would join on the forums, and this is where discussions can get really deep into players' news, different strategies for the game, updates on what might be going on. And so this is that next level, the deepest membership into the fantasy community, the FF Today community. And this is where I joined to really learn more about fantasy football as a player. And then also as a teacher, I wanted to start getting some ideas about maybe using fantasy football in a classroom. So one of my first posts when I was a newbie was just to get information, ask some questions. I'm in a league where I get to keep a certain number of players off of my roster from last year, and so I just went on and asked about which players to keep. I got some responses back, and then I had some ideas, and so I went back and forth, and that was a great initial entry in. And that's made me feel more confidence to maybe launch my own ideas in my own forum. And so I was asking about using fantasy football in school. So I posted this up here. I asked for maybe different stories people had playing fantasy football that I might be able to share with parents when I did this in the next year. And I got a lot of response. There's about 3 pages worth of responses here, and most of them were very positive, but there's some negative too, but I'll get into that in a second. So this was typical of a positive response. This member shared a story that he had about playing some fantasy football, and then also some really constructive ideas about how you can use these ideas going forward. And so this idea of maybe having people students write evaluation about a floor or ceiling. So this was a good example of a communication of positive response to my forum. A negative one This is a member who just did not like this idea. He had lots of trouble. He thought maybe it was gambling, and then he really came back a lot to this idea that this is what a lazy teacher might be doing. And this really hurt some of these. And when I first read these, it made me question this idea and if it was something I should be using, or even really more if I should be in the affinity space, if I should be off the topic of fantasy football this far, bringing in teaching, which can become politicalized. Um, but I think when I finally grew into the community a little more and sort of became an expert of interacting in it, I wrote back to this member and talked to him, or him or her, I'm not sure, about how it made me feel and really what my motivations were. And after this, I did not hear much back from this member. Uh, the member said that we still had a difference of opinion, but he stopped posting, or the member stopped posting, and I think the member just wanted to be heard, just have their concerns be heard. Um, and so connecting back to the readings that were about the affinity space for class, especially in the Gee and Hayes article, some quotes that really clicked with my experience. That the memberships here can range from short-term lurkers to aficionados. I definitely saw that with everything in between, between the staff experts and then the community members on the forum. Fantasy Football Today has all kinds of different ways that people participate and add to the community. Also, this is very makes a lot of sense in a fantasy football community, that there's cooperation in there where they're sharing their ideas and their opinions, but then there's also this competition for status. And if your ideas were right, if you'd pick the right players, you want some status, or there's a level of status in the community. And then I like this idea with the tact knowledge versus explicit knowledge. The tact knowledge is some of the hunches and just ways people have learned to play fantasy football and the decisions they make. But sharing decisions and sharing hunches and reasons, that's the explicit knowledge. That really makes it helpful for all of the members to better their fantasy playing. And this last quote, people get encouragement from the audience and the feedback. I think this is really when the draft season comes up and people are doing what's called mock drafts, or they practice drafting for their fantasy teams. That's definitely a time where that feedback comes up, because you might be trying out a strategy and you share who you drafted in that mock draft, and then you get a lot of feedback on if that was the right decision or not. There are also scholarly connections from texts that were from various different authors. For example, Mortensen talked about Gamergate and some of the anonymous posting that was going on. And one of this quote was interesting to me, talking about the echo chambers, and silencing opposing voices. This is something I felt like was trying to be done to me by a very active poster in my thread about using fantasy football in math instruction. And it just was really important to just kind of understanding that this is something that's out there in these types of discussion forums, and just doing my best to reach out to that person and seeing what I could do to bring him on board. Even though I don't know if I got that member on board, but it did calm the problem. Another piece, this was from the Stevens and All article. This is talking about transfer. And when I'm thinking about transfer of arithmetic skills, fantasy football is that active doing of those arithmetic skills, when taking raw data and then turning it into a score, and using those skills. And so it's that active use, and not just thinking it's going to be a automatic process that happens. And then two quotes from Jenkins and All, talking about simulations. I really see that fantasy football is a simulation for looking at data and making predictions. That's an important skill for my students to learn, and so I think fantasy football is a good a good simulation for that. And then in the second quote, talking about how it's flexible because it can be customizing those models. I can really use whatever kind of coefficients to simulate the different arithmetics that I want my students to be practicing, and so it does give a lot of flexibility in keeping engaging and active learning for my students. And like I'd said, I had great success with my list or my topic that I started in the forum. I got tons of resources from other members. Like I said, it was mostly positive, and so I got these. Here's some examples, some great resources I got. This is a worksheet for practicing different different arithmetic to score. So these would be examples of ways people had scored during a football game, and then practicing taking that data and turning them into points. Here's an interview with an author of a fantasy football curriculum that there were some interesting pieces in, and definitely can be used if I want to talk to an administrator or a parent about why I'm going in this direction. Here's another article from ESPN.com. And again, this is also highlighting educators that have used fantasy football in their classes and their successes. And then an interesting video talking, and then that actually shows students in a classroom as they are learning with fantasy football. So here's a final message.
Well, thank you for watching my presentation about fantasy football and my participation in the FFToday Affinity space. I've been really happy with my membership there. I've learned a lot. I've had some fun, and it's just going to be a great tool for me going forward as playing fantasy football. The Fantasy Football League is coming up. The NFL draft's in the next week, so I'm looking forward to taking knowledge that I've learned from the affinity space and applying that to my playing. And then I'm just going to be ready to win another championship. As for my teaching practice and going forward with this affinity space, I definitely want to continue to communicate about what I've done or what I'm going to do with teaching fantasy football for math. But I probably am not going to want to encourage my students to join the FFToday affinity space. I don't think the moderation is protected enough from trolls or maybe even cyberbullying for younger students. But I think that there are moderated discussion forums that would work well for students, maybe in Edmodo, that could be developed and moderated as my class is working on, or as my students are working on their fantasy football games. So I do think there's a future, and I definitely think my students would benefit from the communication in an infinity space and learning from each other, but just making sure it's moderated for their protection.
And if you're interested in any of the resources or the texts that I spoke about in this presentation, please follow the link for this Google slide presentation on my YouTube channel. And you can connect with the slideshow and follow all the links.